Hey everyone, I'm Amber. I'm the community lead here at Data.World, and my role is that I push forward Data.World's Data for Good and social impact initiatives. And our largest and longest running of these initiatives is our open data platform. This is a place where over 1.5 million people have come to find and contribute to our hundreds of thousands of free and open data sets. Now, I'm going to be talking a little bit about that platform today, but really I want to get into an overview of what open data is, why you might want to make some of your data more open, and how to go about doing that if you want to. So I'm going to actually take a step back before I start diving too deeply into all of this information about open data and talk a little bit about one of my favorite things, the World Wide Web. We all know it, we love it. It's a place where you can go and find information, you can click around and learn new things, and you can contribute back. The World Wide Web is what is responsible for me making an Orlando Bloom fan page on Neopets way back in the day. It's a cool place to be. And part of what allows the web to be so adjustable and so useful for so many different people worldwide is how it's put together and some of the technical aspects of how it works. So, at sort of a high level, the web is useful, at least to me, because most of the content on it is freely accessible. So, when we talk about the World Wide Web, we often talk about web pages. Sometimes they're referred to as documents or websites, but most of the time, when you go to these places, the information there is freely accessible. And of course, sometimes you might go to a site where information is behind a paywall or a login wall or something like that. But a lot of the information you can get without any sort of login information or any sort of monetary uh, thing being passed between hands. It's also great because all of this information is linked together. If you've spent pretty much any time using websites on the web, you'll have noticed that there are hyperlinks, things that if you click on them, it'll take you from one site to another. For me, this is great because it allows me to find background information or source information from things that I'm learning about. And sometimes it allows me to just dive down really deep internet rabbit holes and learn more and keep expanding on these topics. Now, the other reason that the web is able to do everything it can do is because all of these documents are distributed in such a way that I don't have to leave my house and go to, say, my public library to access data.world or twitter.com. I can do it from anywhere in the world. To that point, if I go onto any web browser in the world and type in www.twitter.com, I'm going to get to Twitter. There's only one unique address for websites on the internet, and they work for everyone in the same way. So that really allows the web to have created this network of documents, again, often referred to as web pages or websites, that are, for the most part, freely accessible, linked together, and distributed across the world. Now, the creator of the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee, has challenged folks a number of years ago now to sort of wonder, what if we had this same system, not just for documents, not just for websites with text and photos and videos, but what if we had the same system set up for data, all different kinds of data? What if it was just like documents on the web, freely accessible, linked together, and distributed across the world? Now, this general idea is referred to as open data, and more specifically, Tim Berners-Lee was talking about linked open data. So I'm going to get a little bit into the differences between those phrases. So we'll start with just straightforward open data. There are a lot of definitions that people use for this concept. The one I'm referring to is sort of a high level definition, just that data that is open, it can be freely used, modified, and shared by anyone for any purpose. There's a few caveats here that sometimes you have to provide attribution or include information about where the data came from, but for the most part, free, open, can be modified, can be shared. Should sound pretty familiar to what I was talking about with websites on the web. Now, open data can be used for a ton of purposes. For many years, you may not have been familiar with open data, but for the past few years, it has been a hot button topic because of, you guessed it, COVID. So, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had counties, cities, states, countries, the whole world really, trying to get information on what was going on with this pandemic. And so everybody was sort of working very quickly to get information. Folks were trying to share information to figure out what was happening in other parts of the world and combine that with what was happening in their part of the world. Now, this was also very useful for communicating this information. I'm not sure if this happened to anyone else, but I tend to be a pretty data fanatic type person, but not everyone in my life is. But lots of folks in my life during the COVID pandemic started refreshing COVID dashboards all the time. They were just checking in on the data all the time. And this very often was open data, sometimes brought together by journalists or researchers or scientists or other folks who were putting together this data to communicate information. So open data is really huge when it comes to communication, to empowering people to understand what's happening in their area and holding other folks accountable, especially when it comes to government data. A lot of people really hold firm the idea that making government data open increases transparency, gives people a look into why decisions are being made. So it can really have far-reaching impact. Now, on a less, I suppose, serious note, open data is also very useful to folks who are learning data. That is data analysis, data science, data visualization, all of these aspects. You really only get better at it when you start practicing with real actual data sets. So there are a number of challenges that exist on the internet where folks share an open data set, sometimes once a week, sometimes once a month, and they challenge a group of people to do something with that data set. Usually it's create a data visualization. Sometimes it is to clean it or solve a machine learning problem. But the fact that we have so many open data sets really gives folks a wide array of topics to choose from to practice all of their data skills and get better as they're entering or improving in this environment. Pardon me. Okay, so there's a lot of things that you can do with open data. And maybe you're listening to me and you're like, yeah, I would actually like to open up some of my data and make it useful for some people, which, if that's your takeaway already, wonderful, super excited to hear that. But you might be wondering how you go about making your data more open and what it means to truly be open data. So Tim Berners-Lee, again, the gentleman who created the World Wide Web, gave us another gift in a sort of standard called 5-star open data. Basically what this is a framework to think about open data. It can be open and have 1 star. It's technically open data, but it has a long way to go. It can be a lot more open, all the way up to 5 stars of open data. Again, 1 star, 5 star, both considered open. It's just how open it is and how reusable it is for other people. So we'll start looking at what these 5 stars are. The first is that it is available on the internet and it has an open license. So I'm going to pause here for 1 second and note that sometimes when people talk about open data sets or open data in general, they might be talking about technically open, which means that your data is available in a technical aspect. It's on the internet. Often you'll hear folks talk about machine readable files, which we will talk about shortly. But that's what it means to be technically open. There's also the idea of legally open, which means that people can legally do stuff with your data. In order for something to be legally open, it needs to have a designated open data license. So for instance, here's just a handful of open data licenses that you can add to an open data set. And basically each of these licenses just details the kind of things that users can do with the data. Some of them, if there's a check mark in the attribution file, they need to provide attribution to where they got the data set from. If you are planning to use open data in your business for commercial purposes, you need to make sure that the data you're using is licensed in such a way that allows for commercial use. Otherwise, you are not using the data set the way that it was intended, and so on and so forth. So personally, I really love open data licenses, in part because it makes my data more open, but also because fewer people have to contact me to ask, how they can use my data. It's all spelled out right in the license, what they can and can't do with it. Importantly, and this sort of deviates from things like open source code, which are copyrighted by default. If you don't have a license on your open data, no one can do anything with it. They can't use it, they can't share it, they can't repost it or add to it. They can't touch it, legally speaking. So if you want your data to be both technically and legally open, it needs to be online and it needs to have an open data license associated. Okay, that's 1 star. To get 2 stars, you need to have everything involved in one, online, with an open license, and the data needs to be structured. Now, what this means is that it needs to be in a format that makes it easy for other people to use. So here's an example. Here's some information about an elf owl. The smallest owl, weighing in as little as 31 grams and measuring some 13.5 centimeters, is the elf owl. Very good information about owls. And maybe you want to reuse some of this data. There's information here that can be useful to other people. But putting it in a sentence like that is really unstructured data. It's hard to extract. If you wanted to analyze a whole bunch of information on owls, getting a whole bunch of just raw text like that is really not going to be very useful. Slightly more useful is a table inside of a PDF. The reason I said slightly more useful is because PDFs are not really great either. They're better than completely unstructured data of just raw text, but they can be better. PDFs kind of flatten information. You also have the truly cursed image of a table inside of a PDF. Please don't do that. It's very difficult for other people to do or to use it. So what's really best is if your data is in a more structured format, like say a spreadsheet in Excel or something like that. This allows people to really reuse the data. It's in a format that's a lot more structured. The information is in columns and the file itself is easy for people to use. All right, that's 2. 3rd star. The data is online, open license, structured in a non-proprietary data format. What that means is that there are some data programs that when you export data from them, they are in a specific format that can only be opened if you have that program. For instance, things like MATLAB, SAS, even PDF is one of these formats that you need to actually own the correct software in order to open it. So if you say are working in SAS, for instance, and you output data that you've been working really hard on and you want to share it with someone else so they can do something with it, but that person doesn't have the SAS software, that is quite an expensive piece of software just for them to be able to explore your data. So it's much easier for folks to work with data that's in a non-proprietary data format, things like a CSV, a JSON, a text file that they can open through a number of different data programs. Now, I'm going to pause because before I started here at Data.World, I actually have been a data journalist. I've been a research scientist. I've been involved in the open data space for a number of years. And I thought right here was the epitome of open data. This is as far as I knew existed. I would make data online, add open data licenses. It was structured in a non-proprietary format. And I even added metadata, lots of information about where the data came from and how to interpret it. And that's really great. And if that's as far as you understand open data, that's fabulous. There are 2 more stars. We can make our data more open than this. And this is starting to get into what I had referred to earlier as linked data. It's bringing the data closer to that analogy of the World Wide Web and how all of those documents are connected to one another. So the 4th and 5th stars have to do with how we denote things and how we link to other data. That might not make sense if you're unfamiliar with linked data, so I'll give you an example. Pretend I have a spreadsheet, and in this spreadsheet is a column called name, and there is the name Anne Hathaway in here twice. Now, if you're cleaning data, you might think that's just a duplicate and you want to get rid of it, but you probably know better and might be aware that there maybe just are two different Anne Hathaways. After some digging, you might have realized that one Anne Hathaway refers to the American actor and the other refers to William Shakespeare's wife. Now, you obviously want to make sure that you don't get these two mixed up as you're analyzing your data. So what a lot of people will do is introduce a column with, like, say, an ID number. This is usually a unique identifier that within your data set indicates just one thing. So there will never be another thing in this data set with the ID 36301. If you see that, it refers to Anne Hathaway, the actor. Now, this is all well and good for this data set, but it only works in this data set. So if I have that ID number for Anne Hathaway, the actor, and I look in other data resources, 36301 is actually also a postal code in Alabama. And if I'm looking in a trading card database, it's actually a Paraguayan soccer player. So that number is only unique within this data set. So another way to identify different values within your data sets, rather than using a string, well, in this case, a string of numbers, you could use what we call a URI. Now, much like a URL on the internet, these are unique. There will never be another URI that is wikidata.org/wiki/Q36301 because that only refers to Anne Hathaway, the actor. Now, Wikidata is just one example. You'll see some more in a minute, but this is, again, just like URLs in the sense that there's only one. They're very unique and they work anywhere in the world. Anywhere in the world that you go and look at this URI, you are going to get data about Anne Hathaway, the actor. Now, I'm still representing this as if it were tabular data in something like a CSV file. And you can represent data in this way, but often when we're talking about data that is represented by URIs that are, again, available worldwide, usually we start talking about data in a graphical format. So I'm going to show just a high-level overview of what that might look like. So we might recognize that both Anne Hathaways are instances of humans. They're both people. They have images associated with them that I've been showing you this whole time. And both of them can be recognized by these specific Wikidata links. Again, that sort of give additional information as to who exactly we're talking about. Now at this point, and even on the last slide, you're up to 4 stars of data. That's amazing. If you want to get that 5th star, what Tim Berners-Lee says is you have to link your data to other data sources for context. So what that means is recognizing that this Wikidata link for Anne Hathaway, the actor, is referring to the same person as this entry in DBpedia, as this entry in IMDb, and so on and so forth. So you are able to then take all of the information. Wikipedia might have only included information about Anne Hathaway, the actor's birthplace and her parents and things like that, whereas IMDb might tell you about her filmography. And because we recognize the URI from Wikidata and the URI from IMDb are talking about the same person, we can combine them and now have a ton of additional information. So that's how you get 5 stars of data. Pretty complicated, but it's something that I have faith you can do if you're interested. And again, any level of open data is amazing and can be really helpful. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that 5-star open data is only one way to think about this. Another very common way to assess how open data might be, or how, people refer to it as fair. How fair the data is using fair data principles. And that refers to how findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable it is. And this carries a lot of the same ideas as the 5-star open data. Fair data technically doesn't have to be open, but if we're assuming that it is in this case, we're talking about data that's findable, both for humans and for computers. accessible with metadata that can be accessed even after the data itself is gone, interoperable across different systems and platforms and software systems, and reusable. Fair data is really about reuse, providing the information that people need to use your data for another purpose. Now, if you're interested in learning more about fair data principles, you can either go to the website on this slide or you can hang around because we are going to be talking about fair data principles in the next talk. But briefly, if you are interested in expanding your data and making it more open, Data.world has some things that would help with that. So here's an example of a data set on the Data.world platform. And you'll notice that we have a space for you to designate a license, lots of space for you to indicate how the data was collected with any sort of method information, an activity tab so folks can see where data has changed over time, and probably my personal favorite, a data dictionary so that you can describe all of the data and what it all means. Now, that easily will take you up to that third star of open data. If you want to get to the fourth and fifth, we're going to be showing you more how to do that in the next talk. So hang around. Hopefully you are interested in joining us. Sign up at the following link. It's totally free, and we hope to see you there. Thanks so much.